All right. Hey, good evening, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 3. I'm going to pull up my screen here to share. Does that show up for everybody? Can everybody see that?
Looks good.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. All right, so Daniel chapter 3. We are coming out of Daniel 2, and we had looked at the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was given the dream, but if you recall, the dream was not ultimately about him and his kingdom. That the statue that he dreamed about, he was one component of that dream, but really the entire dream was about Gentile history over the course of the times of the Gentiles, and ultimately it was about God's kingdom and how, what would transpire basically in Gentile kingdoms through the course of human history prior to God establishing his kingdom on earth. That's really what the dream was about. And ultimately, from a Jewish perspective and from God's perspective, it was a re-emphasis or a restatement of the Davidic covenant, that he was going to have an eternal throne with an eternal seed from the line of David reigning on earth. And this eternal king would reign in an eternal kingdom. And so it's really fascinating, because when you tie that into the context of where we're at in Daniel, the nation of Israel is in exile. Their homeland has not been completely destroyed yet. That awaits them in 586, but there have been two deportations. They await the third and final deportation into exile in Babylon. But it gives Daniel, it gives the Jewish people in exile really comfort to know that God still intends to keep his unconditional promises made in the Abrahamic covenant and then expanded upon in the land covenant, the Davidic covenant, and also the new covenant recorded in Jeremiah. And so even while they're in exile due to rebellion, God is giving them a comforting message that he still intends to fulfill the Davidic covenant. And so that moves us into Daniel chapter 3. And in Daniel chapter 3, we're not exactly sure what motivated Nebuchadnezzar to build this statue that he's going to require worship of. It could have been his dream in Daniel chapter 2, but a couple of years have probably passed from Daniel 2 to Daniel 3, and we just don't have those details. We can't get behind the mind or into the motivations of King Nebuchadnezzar, but it could have been an idea that he got from the dream in Daniel chapter 2. And so in the first 7 verses of this chapter, Daniel chapter 3, we see the establishment of the worship of Nebuchadnezzar's golden image. And so let's read verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And so Nebuchadnezzar's declaration about Daniel's God in 247, which we'll read in a second, did not translate into a monotheistic theology for him. In fact, several years had most likely elapsed since the events in chapter 2. It's likely that Nebuchadnezzar's memory was short. Maybe he had kind of forgotten or just moved on with his life. But remember in verse 47 of chapter 2, we read, the king answered Daniel and said, truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. And so we see Nebuchadnezzar coming along, but as we said last week, it probably wasn't a declaration of personal faith, rather that he was just amazed by Daniel's God and what he could do. So it wasn't like he changed his theology. He's still very polytheistic, and that's most likely why he built this statue. Now, it's quite possible that Nebuchadnezzar could have gotten the idea for this statue from his dream in chapter 2, but again, we cannot be certain. What's interesting about this statue in chapter 3, in comparing it to his dream in chapter 2 just had a head of gold. And his kingdom represented that head of gold. Now he creates an entire statue of gold. And as we said there, it was in the dream, it's replaced by another kingdom made of silver. And so building the entire statue of gold, it may have been, I don't want to be dogmatic there, but it may have been Nebuchadnezzar's way of saying his kingdom would be permanent, as reflected by the entire image being gold. We don't know for sure. Again, the text simply doesn't say. And so it may have also been a way for Babylonians to wipe out any Jewish remnant of thinking or to test Jewish loyalty to him. They've got a group of exiles now in their kingdom, and this may have been a way to test loyalty. It may have been a way to drive out any kind of Jewish heritage. That was what they tried to do with the young men in their training in chapter 1, was to kind of erase their heritage. So we don't exactly know, but these are potential reasons for that. The image itself, in terms of translating those cubits, we don't use that measurement anymore. The image itself was probably roughly about 90 feet high and about 9 feet wide. And so we're unsure what the image was. Was it an image of himself? Was it a combination of a human and an animal? Or was it Nebuchadnezzar's patron god, Nebo? The text simply does not say. I think sometimes we confuse this story with the tribulation period, where there will be a statue made of the Antichrist. But that said, that's actually clearly told to us in Revelation 13. This is not told to us. He just made a statue, and it's an image of gold. We don't really know what that image is. And so let's read verses 2 through 3. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image, which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And so what he does is, in verses 2 through 3, calls together all of the political and governmental leaders in Babylon. Part of the reason for this is so that other people would also follow in bowing down to the statue. This was mass manipulation and societal pressure on a grand scale. Nebuchadnezzar, I think, figured that if he could get the leaders there doing it, that everybody else would follow in their footsteps. And so Daniel recorded the 8 levels of political guests in precise order to emphasize the importance the king placed on this mandatory summons. This was kind of a, as it's labeled there, let's see, they're coming to a dedication. Okay, they're rolling this image out. So this is kind of the dedication, opening ceremonies, if you will, for this image. And so here were the list of government officials. A satrap was the highest regional authority in a province. A prefect was a regional military chief. A governor was a captain or a regional ruler in a province. A counselor or advisor was a high-ranking judge in a province. A treasurer was a provincial treasury superintendent. A judge was a lower-ranking advisor or judge that may have reported to the counselor or the advisors. A magistrate was again a lower-level legal official. And then number 8, a ruler of a province was a grassroots assistant to the provincial satrap. So we obviously have some different terminology in our day for government officials, but you can see just in terms of the description of their roles, these were the administrative officials in each of these provinces of Babylon. They were called all together. So all of the leaders were called together. Clearly Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were a part of that leadership group. We saw that they had gotten promoted. At the end of Daniel chapter 2, verse 49, Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. And so they were involved in this group, and thus this is why they were summoned to this dedication of the image. And so Nebuchadnezzar knew that if every government official worshiped the image, common citizens would immediately be compelled to follow suit. And so after his defeat in chapter 2, this mandated assembly was likely orchestrated by Satan to regain absolute control over his crown jewel, Babylon. Remember, Satan is active in the affairs of kingdoms. We learned that multiple places, but you could see that he was probably trying to establish a world empire. This has always been Satan's goal, is to take over, to establish a world empire, which at some level he'll be successful during the tribulation. He'll have a one world government, a one world religion, a one one leader overseeing the entire world through the Antichrist, but this has always been Satan's goal. We learn about him in Isaiah 14 that Lucifer, let's just read it, how you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations. This is part of what Satan is doing now, weakening nations so that he might control or provide sway over nations. Verse 16, those who see you will gaze at you and consider you, saying, is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world as a wilderness and destroyed its cities, who did not open the house of his prisoners? And so we see this description of Satan as one who weakens nations, who makes the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms. And so, you see him in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar is starting to give praise to the God of Daniel. And I think he inserts himself to reclaim some level of sway and authority. And we know from 1 John 5:19 that John writes, we know that we are God and the whole world lies under the sway of the wicked one. And this was true in Daniel's day and Nebuchadnezzar's day as well. Now in verse 4, we read that a herald cried aloud, and he said, to you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And so almost like a Muslim call to prayer in the East now. When the people heard the music at this dedication ceremony, they were to fall down wherever they were and worship the golden image. Again, for people in a polytheistic society, this would have been no big deal. This would have been just one added thing that they would add to their daily worship or their required worship. In fact, as we look at some of the Jewish people, they could have even rationalized this situation and said, well, this is just a country loyalty thing. It's just like saluting the flag. It's only one-time deal. We're at the dedication ceremony. What's the big deal? Just do it and get it over with. There may have been some Jews who rationalized it this way. In fact, we know that some of the Jewish people were already engaged in idolatry. This is what had cost them or sent them into exile in the first place. And so many who were present, who had a Jewish background, may not have learned their lesson or even cared at this point. In fact, as we go through the story, it looks like only 3 men didn't fall down in worship. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody necessarily was there that day in the empire, but it does probably at least reflect that many Jewish exiles didn't care and probably bowed down to this image that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Now, in verse 6, or actually back in verse 1, I think I put verse 2 in the notes. It's actually verse 1. We learned that Nebuchadnezzar set up this statue in the plains of Dura. We see that in verse 1, actually. You can correct that in the notes. Which seems like an insignificant fact until you consider the consequence for not bowing down to his statue. We learn from the text in verse 6 that the consequence was that they would be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And so in Dura, there were kilns nearby used for smelting and brick making. And so when the text says immediately, it meant it, since there were means of executing the judgment for disobedience were conveniently nearby. Okay, and so verse 7, we see that either faced with falling down or worshiping the gold image or immediate death, most of the people chose worshiping the golden image with the exception of a few. And as we'll look at the few, who they were. And so, although the final deportation of the Jews was still in the future at this point, again, as we're looking at the story in Daniel 3, we're not quite to 586 yet. That's when the final deportation of the Jews and the destruction of Jerusalem happens. All of those who had been deported to Babylon from Judah had a decision to make. Will I bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's statue and be safe from harm? Or will I not bow down in allegiance to Yahweh and face potential execution? Again, all of the Jews present that day had that decision to make. What would they decide? Well, we see that 3 of them decided they would remain loyal to Yahweh. They would abide by the Mosaic law, which says that they were not to worship any other gods. And so we'll see. Now, many people have asked at this point, where's Daniel in this story? Did he bow down? Is that why he's not mentioned? I would highly doubt that. We don't know. So Daniel's not mentioned in chapter 3 in the sense of where he was or what his role was in this whole scenario. But most likely Daniel was off doing business for King Nebuchadnezzar and wasn't present for this event. Otherwise, based on his testimony, based on his actions thus far in the book, and based on his actions going forward in the future, it's most likely Daniel would have also stood with these three men. But again, we don't know. It's pure speculation. But that would make the most sense. I think it would be poor speculation without a lot of evidence to say he bowed down to the image. I think that would be harder to prove that he did. I think easier to prove that he was probably not there, and thus he's not included with the three men that stood. All right, so we see in verse 7 that they started all the music, and all the people, it says, fell down and worshiped the gold image. But in verse 8, we see some accusations are brought. In fact, the informants bring their accusations. Apparently, some of the Chaldeans, most likely jealous of this meteoric rise of the Jewish young men, were keeping a close eye on them to report them. As these men are falling down to worship, they're kind of keeping one eye open, and there's three guys standing up. It's those Jewish guys that we don't like to begin with. And let's kind of develop that. But let's read verses 8 through 12. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of all these instruments, I'm just going to skip forward, shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. And so we see that certain Chaldeans came forward to accuse Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and their accusations were right, as we're seeing. These men had not bowed down to the image, and they must have stood out like sore thumbs. I don't know if you've ever been in a room where everyone is seated, but you're the only one standing up. Or vice versa, everyone's standing up and you're the only one seated. You just kind of stand out like a sore thumb, even if you're not trying to. So they clearly didn't fall down and worship this image. But it leads us to ask the question again, who were the Chaldeans? Well, these men were the elite establishment of wise men in Babylon, and they had probably been shown up by these young men over the course of their 3-year training. We see that in Daniel chapter 1, verses 4 through 7. Remember, they were probably shown up there. Daniel was kind of elevated at the end of chapter 1. We know that they had probably also been shown up by Daniel and his friends in chapter 2, because Daniel was able not only interpret the king's dream, but also tell what the king's dream was. And then we know at the end of Daniel 2 that Daniel became their boss, right? In verse 48, it says, the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. The Chaldeans would have been part of this group that Daniel was now overseeing. And so clearly, these men were out for revenge, and they took this as an opportunity to remove these three young men whom they viewed as threats or competition to their careers, probably. Because as we look at this word, accused in verse 8, it's literally translated or literally meant to consume or devour. And so this was someone who was ravenously accusing a foe. It was, I believe the word was used of animals ravenously consuming an animal they had caught that they were eating, so to speak. And so it kind of gives you the picture of the aggression with which these men had brought the accusations. Now, what's interesting is that Nebuchadnezzar apparently knew these young men, or he knew about them, because he had put them in positions of authority in his kingdom at the recommendation of Daniel, right? Daniel had petitioned the king, verse 49 of chapter 2 told us. And so he set these men in positions of authority. But it's still apparent that although Nebuchadnezzar made this great declaration in chapter 2, verse 47, It's apparent that he didn't understand their religion fully, didn't understand their God fully, clearly. And so it's interesting to note, as well as we look at the accusation by the Chaldeans, is they make it a point to identify these three young men as Jews. They remind the king that he was the one who appointed them to their position of authority. Notice that in verse 8, he says, let's jump down. Verse 12, there are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of Babylon. So they're kind of pointing the finger at the king in some ways, and they're kind of bringing out the fact that these guys may not be with us, king. They may not be patriots. They might be accusing them of that way. And most likely, again, Nebuchadnezzar took their disobedience in this area as disloyalty to him, to his empire, and it was most likely a nationalistic issue to him, not really a religious issue necessarily, although there was some overlap here. But I think primarily it was a nationalistic issue to him. He's got people in leadership that may not be loyal to his empire. That was a problem in his thinking. And also notice that the accusation by the Chaldeans did not just involve worship of the statue in question. That was clear that they had not bowed down to the worship. But notice they also make a negative comment about the fact that these young men did not even worship Nebuchadnezzar's other gods. Okay, and so you can see that at the end of verse 12. And it says, they do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. So they're really painting these three young men in a negative light. They're basically saying, look, Nebuchadnezzar, you've put them in a position of authority in your kingdom, and they're not even patriots. They're not even with you. They don't even worship. Not only did they not worship your gold statue, they don't even worship your God. So they're really painting the scene. They're laying it on thick, this accusation against these men. And Nebuchadnezzar, he reacts. He's very upset. He's very fired up. In fact, verse 13 is going to give us a double combo here as we kind of read verse 13. But let's read verses 13 through 15, and let's just see his initial reaction of anger. Verse 13, then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now, if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? And so we see that Nebuchadnezzar is angry, fire hot, mad. Rage and fury are placed side by side in this account to intensify the depiction of the king's fury. It's a double emphasis. Again, letting us know that he's extremely angry. And basically he says here in the next two verses, look, I'm going to give you one more chance because maybe you didn't hear the command correctly. Maybe you didn't understand the consequences for not following the command. So let me tell you again. And he gives them another opportunity. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar asks a great question. He says, who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? And he seems to have forgotten his own words in 247, that when he said about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God in 247 was, truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, the revealer of secrets, since you could reveal the secret. But now he forgets. He says, who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? And because Nebuchadnezzar viewed himself as a god, he could not imagine a God powerful enough to save these three young men from a fiery furnace. He couldn't do it. None of his gods could do it. But he's about to get introduced again to the God who can and will deliver these young men from his hands. Again, remember chapter 2 had clearly communicated this idea that no human being or even any of the Babylonian gods could do what Nebuchadnezzar was asking the wise men to do, which was to tell the contents of his dream and then provide the interpretation. But again, in chapter 2, we learn Yahweh could do what no one else could do. He could give the contents of his dream. He could provide the interpretation. We're going to see that same lesson put on display here. Nebuchadnezzar has forgotten. He's going to get reintroduced to this God of gods who's able to not only give him the contents and interpretation of his dream, but now rescue these three young men from the consequence of their actions. And so in verses 16 through 18, we have such a beautiful response by these young men. They are going to respond well, and also by doing so, they introduce the God who is able to deliver them from Nebuchadnezzar, at least introduce them. They don't claim they know what he's going to do, but they're saying, look, our God can do it if he wants to, is basically what they're going to say. And so in verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we read, answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. So very clear, very direct, also very respectful in understanding of the fact that they're engaging in civil disobedience, and there may be consequences that result from that. So again, as we look at their response, they really handle this situation delicately and respectfully, because they recognize that even in this situation, the civil government is in authority over them. They don't say, well, you don't have authority over me. We're Jews, that we only, they don't say, well, we only listen to the king of Israel or anything like that. They recognize that he's got authority over them. They recognize that they are there in exile because of the nation's sin, and that's where they're at. And so they respond and say, it can appear rude, but they say, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Literally, they're saying, we do not need to return a word to you. And so they're specifically responding to his question, I believe, who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? And they just said, well, we don't need to return a word to you on that answer. In fact, the reason it doesn't require a verbal exchange is because of what they will share in verses 17 through 18. And it's simply this: either their God will or will not deliver, and it's based upon his own will in this situation. So they don't need to get in a theological back and forth, an argument about monotheism or polytheism. They're just saying, look, our God's able. We're not sure that he's willing. And that's kind of their answer. So notice they don't dictate. I like this, this looking at their response. They don't dictate to God the outcome, nor do they expect God to deliver a certain outcome. They are willing to accept death or deliverance. And boy, we could take such a great lesson from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because how often do we pray and our prayers are all outcome driven. We want the outcome that we want. Now, it's true that we're told to pray our desires, and we're told to pour out our heart to the Lord, and that's true. So we ask God for outcomes, but the heart of hearts behind that is to say, you know what, we don't really know what God's going to do in terms of the outcome. We're going to pray our desires, but we're going to trust him with the results. We're going to trust him with the outcome. And notice in verse 17, they say, if that's the case, in other words, if you decide to throw us into the fiery furnace, our God is definitely able to deliver us. But what they're saying is, we're not sure that he's willing. We're not sure if he's willing to do it in this instance, but we know he's able. That's not even a question. And that's kind of their point in verse 17. So they weren't claiming they knew God's will in this particular matter of being delivered, but they were positive on what his will was concerning Nebuchadnezzar's image. That was something that they had no debate on, no hesitations on. They knew they were not to bow down and worship other idols. And so they knew that for a fact. And so they knew that was God's will. They just didn't know what the will of God was related to their being delivered. And so, again, as I mentioned, it's really incredible truth, because they were fully trusting God while totally accepting any outcome. And obviously, what a great example for each one of us there. So in verse 18, they say, but if he doesn't deliver us, let it be known to you, O king. And so if by chance our God is unwilling, we will still not bow down to your image or worship other gods. They clearly communicate their position and their unwillingness to yield to the king's command. So they maintain, it's this delicate balance, right? They maintain this proper respect for the king in his position, and yet they engage in civil disobedience with a willingness to accept the consequences for their actions. And so when they deemed that the government was asking them to do something that was in contrast with the word of God, They chose the word of God over the civil magistrates' requirements, and then they were willing to accept whatever consequences might be due to them from the civil magistrates. And again, just a great example of if it's ever necessary to engage in civil disobedience, the way that we should engage. We also saw that back in the time of Moses, when Moses was born, and the civil disobedience that was engaged in by the Hebrew midwives. And so, again, willing to accept the consequences, but not willing to break the law or the dictates of a higher authority, in this case, God being the highest authority over even civil government. And so they respond to the king. And now we see the king's second response in verses 19 through 21. And we're going to see that he's really angry now. He was angry before, but now he's super angry. Verse 19, the Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fire furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. So to say that Nebuchadnezzar was mad would be an understatement. The text tells us he was full of fury, meaning he was completely filled up with rage and he could not get any angrier. And so this fury is kind of borne out in 4 ways in the verses we just read. Notice it says that the expression on his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Before he was like, hey, it might have been something like, hey guys, I'm not really happy with you, but maybe I'm going to give you another chance, to take this chance. But now they've directly told him, no, we knew what we were doing the first time. We're not going to bow down to your statue. If you got to kill us, you got to kill us. And in the face of that direct opposition, the expression on his face changed. I think it means he had an angry look on his face. He probably was gnashing his teeth. That image that we have from Stephen later in the book of Acts, chapter 7, where the religious leaders were gnashing their teeth at him. I think he's full of fury. He's super upset. And notice that the second thing he did is he spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. Now, this is an overreaction, but Nebuchadnezzar is known for overreacting. We're going to see that in this account. We've seen that before in his life. And he commands that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Now, just do the comparison on that for a second. Take a simple casserole that we bake in the oven at 350. That was 7 times more is 2,450 degrees. You can see that this is an overreaction. And I think it was Warren Wiersbe had a great quote. He said, when a man gets full of fury, he gets full of folly. And we see this borne out in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, if he truly wanted to hurt them and he truly wanted to punish them, he should have cooled the furnace down and slow cooked them, right? Because we're going to see what happens in a normal situation with the heat this high as we go forward in the story. It basically incinerates the guards that were throwing them in because it's so hot. And so in terms of if he wanted to really torture them and punish them, he actually should have cooled it down from the normal temperature and slow cooked them. But again, when a man gets full of fury, he gets full of folly. Notice the third thing, he commanded the strongest men in his army to do the duty of tying them up and throwing them into the furnace. Again, Nebuchadnezzar didn't want to leave anything to chance. The fact that they might break loose and run away or escape. So he had them tie them up. And then finally, we notice that we've got this kind of this weird verse. It doesn't seem like, why is this a big deal? Verse 21, it seems like ancillary material that doesn't need to be said, but it'll come in because they're tossed fully clothed in. Again, it seems like nothing more than a side comment in the narrative, but we're going to see it's a detail which will become fascinating in the next few verses. So anytime, by the way, I had a professor in seminary told me one time, and it's really borne out to be true. But he said anytime the text gives a physical description of some clothes that somebody's wearing, or a physical description of their beauty or their hair or their body or whatever, that it will eventually come out in the text why that was significant, that Hebrew writers would include physical descriptions, and because they're going to bring something out as it relates to physical descriptions later in these narratives. And we're going to see that this is true in the case of Daniel 3. And so the execution is finally ordered here, and the consequence is carried out and executed. But as we're going to see, not with the desired results of the king, not what he wanted to see. And so verse 22, it says, therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Now, that should have been the end of the story. And we're going to see that it's not. It's just the beginning, actually. And so the king's rash decision to have the furnace heated so hot cost his strongest soldiers their lives. This shows us how hot the furnace really was to be able to kill the men who were just near it. These men didn't actually get into the fire. They were just near it, approaching it to throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire. And as they got near it, it sounds like they were just completely incinerated. That's how hot the furnace had been heated. Now, this should have been Nebuchadnezzar's first clue that something was not right about this situation. Why had his men died and the young Jewish men had not? How were they able to survive being near the fire when his men had not been able to survive being near the fire? Now, notice again, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell into the fire. They were not thrown in. The men who were going to throw them in had burnt up. And so now they kind of tripped. I don't know what happened. They fell into the fire. And what's incredible about this position is they were completely helpless. They were tied, right? They were on the ground. They were bound. And so there's no way they were able to save themselves at this point. Again, they were bound up. They couldn't get up. They were truly helpless, and they were in a place to quickly burn to death. In fact, so far it's like, wow, why haven't they burned to death yet? If the men burned up being near, why did these three men even make it to the fire? And so you can tell something's going on here. Now, let's look at the king's third response in verses 24 and 25. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, did we not cast three men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. Look, he answered, I see four men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the fourth is like the Son of God. And so this time, Nebuchadnezzar is not angry. His response is now to something that he observed. Now, apparently, Nebuchadnezzar was watching this whole thing unfold almost like it was entertainment, kind of a sadistic way to be entertained, but apparently he was watching it from afar. And the text tells us that he was astonished, and that word means to be alarmed or to be startled. It reflected an attitude or emotion implying a degree of fear. There was something that shocked him, and there was a fear element associated with this response. The text also tells us that he rose in haste. It's like he was sitting down, it sounds like, and then he got up to maybe get a closer look, and he's, whoa, what's going on here? And he spoke to his counselors. He was really startled by what he saw. And notice his question. It's kind of a funny question. He wants to confirm something with his counselors. He wants to confirm, okay, how many men did we throw into the fire? This is because, I'm doing the math here. I'm counting on my fingers, and it looks like there's more people in the fire. And he said, wait a minute, we've cast three in, right? And they're like, yep, three. That's all it is. So, kind of what's the problem? Well, the problem is he now sees four in there. And in verse 25, now we understand why Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and had a level of fear, and why he tried to confirm some facts. Notice, again, the four reasons that are given to us. Number one, he sees four men, not just three. And, typically when you throw people into the fire, you end up with less people, not more, right? So something odd is going on here. Now, the men that had been thrown in there, with this additional fourth person, they're described as being loose. In other words, They were bound, but the fire apparently had burned off their restraints, or maybe the fourth man had taken the restraints off. We don't really know the details there. But if the fire had burned off their restraints, would it not have burned them as well? So they were bound when they were thrown in. They were on the ground. Now they're up on their feet. They're loose. They're not bound anymore. And then we see that they were all walking around. They weren't lying down anymore. And by the way, just as a point, if they were loosed from their restraints and they were walking around, why were they still in the fire? That's just an odd thing to do, because most normal people in normal situations would immediately jump out of the fire. But these four men were not doing that. And then we saw the fourth observation: the men were not hurt. And so this is absolutely incredible, considering he had just seen what the fire had done to his mighty men of valor. And so now Nebuchadnezzar had just come face to face again with the one and only God who can deliver these men from his hand. And he was shaking in his boots what he saw. And so Nebuchadnezzar himself identifies the fourth figure as the Son of God. But since the word God is plural in Aramaic, it is probably better translated the Son of the gods. And some of you might have translations that actually make the word God plural. And that's probably a more accurate translation. He was probably simply communicating that the fourth figure was a divine being of some sort. In fact, as we get to verse 28, he identifies that fourth figure as an angel. Okay, he says that their God had sent his angel. So Nebuchadnezzar's really not sure what's going on. Okay, and by the way, this makes sense when you take into account Nebuchadnezzar's polytheistic or pagan worldview, where he viewed that there were many gods. And so he just, a son of the god, or the son of the gods, or, this divine figure is what he's really trying to say. So the case could also, I think, be strongly made that this fourth being is none other than the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, which is known as a theophany in the Old Testament. We don't really have time. It's not the purpose of the study to develop that concept of the theophanies that are found in the Old Testament. But this is, I think, an argument can be made. I was actually just talking to Aldi about a pastor that she and I are aware of, a friend of mine, who basically says that this was not a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ, but rather it was an angel. I think Michael, the archangel. But again, it really is hard to be dogmatic on that from the text, and I know my friend is not dogmatic on it either. But the text just doesn't say, but it's possible, and I think it could be strongly made that this is the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, again known as theophanies in the Old Testament. But we won't get hung up on that point. This figure protects Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fire. He loosens them from what was binding them, and then he stands them up on their feet. And I love it. He walks with them. It's just a great image. I mean, he's in the fire with them, right? And you see Jesus. If it was the pre-incarnate Christ, he's right there in the fire with them. He's again, as we're studying through John on Sunday mornings, he's right in the storm with them, and he's just there in terms of personal presence. Just kind of a beautiful image for us to consider. Now we see the aftermath of this decision. And in verse 26 through 30, what is the aftermath of their civil disobedience and stand for Yahweh? Well, let's read it. Verse 26, and Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, probably not too near, I would guess, based on what had happened to his men. And he spoke, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire, and the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word, yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. And the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. What a great end to this story. Verse 26. Notice earlier, Nebuchadnezzar had said, "Who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" And now he calls their God the Most High God. I love that. Servants of the Most High God come out. That's basically saying you guys worship the God of gods, which is what he said back in Daniel 2:47. So he's getting reintroduced to Yahweh. Again, verse 27 tells us that the fire had no power on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's body. Their hair was not singed. Their clothes were not burnt. They didn't even smell like fire. I mean, think about that. Any of you that have been next to a campfire, you smell like smoke just sitting next to a campfire, let alone being in the fire and being near it. And yet the fire had no power over Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Again, notice too, as we see in verse 27, that the same men who had brought the accusations against the three young men were also gathered there, presumably to watch the show of these men being executed. Again, another very sadistic way of being entertained, but these men who had accused them were going to enjoy watching these men burn to death. And so they actually became witnesses to the miracle that had happened, and they saw exactly what had happened. Now, we don't know, right? This is speculation, but this may have been one of the reasons that some of these men, these wise men in Babylon, began to learn the truths about Yahweh and his plan to send a redeemer, because these men, if you recall, were the beginning of the Magi that we find in the Christmas story. And what were the Magi doing? They were following the star to do what? To worship the King of the Jews. And so it might have even been this miracle. This might have been one component that convinced some of these men to believe in the one true God. And, they started off as enemies, turning Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in, but they may have been amazed at this miracle that they had just witnessed. And so in verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar identifies the correct and underlying response that caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to make the decision they did. He calls it out. He says, hey, you guys trusted the Lord. You trusted in your God. He identifies that. And not only that, but he says that they had frustrated the king's word, which is a great way to summarize this whole event. Nebuchadnezzar said, X is going to happen. No one can stop me. And God said, no, X is not going to happen. Y is going to happen. And then it happened exactly the way God said it. Notice also in verse 28, just another great tie into the Christian life. Notice they yielded their bodies. This is what Nebuchadnezzar describes, that they had trusted in him, frustrated the king's word, and they yielded their bodies. And they recognized that their lives were not their own. Again, just another strong exhortation to us in our day. This is what we're exhorted to do, right? Is we are to count ourselves dead to sin, alive to God, and we are to present our bodies, our members, to the Lord, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did in this instance. So these young men had remembered the word of God and remembered who their God was, and these things formulated their response and willingness to accept whatever consequences that may come. And so their willingness to make this decision, to stand on principle and face possible execution for their loyalty to Yahweh, seemed to really impress the king. He really was very impressed by this. He was impressed by their deliverance. And so in verse 29, we see that Nebuchadnezzar got the answer to his question. Who is this God who can deliver you? It's the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's the God of the universe. It's the only true God. But also in verse 29, in typical overreaction fashion, now Nebuchadnezzar decrees that if anyone speaks amiss against the one true God, they will be cut to pieces. Notice he doesn't decree worship of their God, but rather no speaking against their God. It's the idea is that we're going to add their God to our pantheon of gods. Just no one is allowed to say anything negative about their God, but we're not going to demand exclusive worship of the Jewish God. Again, remember the Babylonian mindset was if we conquered them, then that means our gods are more powerful than their God. But they're starting to realize, well, that's not quite the case. This is a little confusing because it's breaking up their worldview in that area. And so in verse 30 again, notice how God continues to advance his own servants within the pagan kingdom of Babylon. Again, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get promoted after this event. And so let's make some kind of general concluding comments about this chapter. One of the things that we see in Daniel is that God even cares about pagan kings. In fact, notice how so far in the book of Daniel, God is using the events in the life of Nebuchadnezzar as part of his spiritual journey. Remember chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar was amazed by the superior wisdom of the Jewish youths. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar was amazed by Daniel's interpretation of his dream. And now in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar was amazed by the miraculous deliverance of the 3 Jewish young men. And as we're going to see, God continues to work in his life in chapter 4 when we get there in the next lesson. And so this story is really just a good reminder for us not to panic in our own lives, but to trust God's word, to trust his character when difficulties come our way. It's always better to abandon our own thinking in lieu of God's revealed wisdom in his word, and just to trust the Lord when outcomes are in doubt in our life, and just be committed to the fact that when God has spoken, that his principles are true and that we can rely upon him and his word. Number 3, these events reveal a satanic plan for Israel's destruction. Again, if his plan had worked here in chapter 3, all Jews would have either converted to pagan idolatry or faced death by fire. Even still, many Jews must have decided just to bow in order to save their own lives. So we can see Satan behind the scenes here, again, trying to eliminate the nation of Israel. Again, ultimately, though, God is showing Satan in the sinful nations of the earth how man's rule is flawed and how God alone is ultimately the one who deserves to reign, which again, that was the entire point of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2, that one day God is going to establish his kingdom. It's going to destroy all the human kingdoms on earth. And so let's close there for the night. And before we end for the night, is there anybody that missed a blank or had a comment or a question before I close this with a word of prayer?
Pastor John?
Yeah, Aldi.
I missed a bunch of blanks, but I'll get them from someone else. It's not a big deal. I just couldn't get logged on at first.
Okay.
But Nebuchadnezzar trusted Jesus eventually, right?
I tell you what, great question. Let's hold it till we get to chapter 4, because we'll talk about it a little bit in chapter 4. Yeah, it's kind of, there's some debate on that, but let's bring that back up in 4. We'll have a good discussion about it.
Okay.
All right.
Great. Super. Thanks.
Yep, you bet. All right.
John, are we
Yep.
Bible study next Sunday?
No. So we're going to take, great question. Let me tell you where we're going from here. We're going to take a few Sundays off. This is September for me. I think I shared is one of the busiest months of the year for me. So we're going to take off from Sunday night for the month of September and part of October, the first part of October. And I think the next time we meet on Sunday night, don't hold me to this, but I'm trying to do this off of memory. I think it's October 22nd. And then we will kind of go until the end of the year with Daniel, but we won't finish. You know, we're gonna do the narrative portion, and then we're gonna come back and circle back and do the prophetic portion. So we'll still be in Daniel even as we get into the new year on Sunday nights. But again, we're gonna take a little bit of a break until about October. I think it's October 22nd, and then we'll pick back up. So I always say during these seasons where we take Sunday nights off, think about some ways that you can be intentional. If it's just getting together with family, you know, that you know normally you don't, or do something special maybe with some family that are out of town, or have somebody from the church over for a meal or for a movie, or we've got groups now in our church that are doing like game nights on Sunday night, doing pickleball. So there's options out there. Unless you've had hip surgery recently, Mom, no pickleball. I don't care how bad you want to try it. But
Oh, John.
but anyways, so just be thinking that, or just be real intentional about getting some rest. If that's what you need, if that's a season of life you're in, and so. But just enjoy that time away, and then we'll pick back up in October again. And so, any other comments or questions or thoughts before I close this with a word of prayer?
John.
Yeah. Hey, Matt.
Kim don't want me to say it, but tell Aldi that the fourth person in the fire, he was the first fireman.
I love it.
That's a good one, man.
Kim,
Encourage him.
Kim didn't want me to say anything. I couldn't help myself. Sorry.
That's good. I'm glad you said it. That's great. All right. Let's see. Sarah. Hey, Sarah.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Good evening. How are you?
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was sitting here thinking, I feel like, considering your sermon today too was on, I had a big question about God drawing us.
Yeah.
God the Father drawing people. So I hope that sermon's not gonna be too late, or too far in advance.
No, we're taking we've got our celebration Sunday next week, and so it'll be the week after that. But I can shoot you a note, and you don't have to stay on the cliffhanger.
Okay.
No,
I feel like it goes hand in hand here with Daniel. I feel like maybe God was drawing Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think he's actively involved and cares about Nebuchadnezzar and trying to draw him, to the truth. So yeah, I would agree.
Yes, that's it. Okay.
Okay, yeah, no, good point. And I'll send you a text. Really, the punchline for everyone that's on here, to me, for the drawing in John 6 is the same word is used in John chapter 12, verse 32. And that's kind of the answer to the question, who does God draw? A Calvinistic mindset is that God only draws those whom he's chosen, which again I think is foreign to the text. But if you look at John 12:32, it says, "And I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all peoples to myself." This he said, signifying by what death he would die. And so basically through the crucifixion, that was God's, what I would call his final ace card in terms of drawing people to himself. And when that event happened, that was the condition that was met. Now he is drawing all people. And so no one has the excuse that they didn't have the ability to believe. Everyone is free and clear to believe. And so that's where we're going with that in terms of trying to understanding the drawing work and how does God draw. We'll kind of look at different ways that he does that and the ways he's done that over the years. But I think the cross is like the ace card. That's what he's really. And that's why we need to be evangelistic, sharing the message, going into the world and preaching the gospel, because that's what God wants to draw people to himself, is through that message. So that's kind of the brief, short answer. And I'll give the long, extended one in a couple of weeks. But anyways, that's kind of the brief answer. Yeah, you bet. All right, let me close this with a word of prayer. And appreciate you guys coming out. I hope the study is good, encouraging, helpful, all of those things, worth your time to spend on a Sunday night. So I appreciate you coming out. Let me pray. Lord, thank you so much for the evening, and thank you so much for your word. As we even just look at these stories, Lord, your character is just littered throughout, and it's just such a pleasure, really, to look at you and consider you and your goodness and your power, your faithfulness, all of these things that we see coming, just bursting forth from this story. We thank you, Lord, for your great love, by which you loved each one of us. We thank you for sending your son to die in our place. The death that we deserved, he took it for us as our substitute. We're so grateful to him for doing that. And we praise you. We pray for our upcoming week, that we would have a week that is just where we are mentally occupied with you, enjoying you every step of the way, in every instance and everything that we're involved in this week. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Good night, son.
All right.
Thanks,
Good night.
Esther.
Thank you, guys. Good night.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Rec-